Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to start talking about what made World War I a world war, because so far it's felt very much like a European war as we talked about the Eastern Front and the Western Front and trench warfare and all those sort of things. Well, World War I was definitely a world war, and there were lots of non-European participants in World War I. And so we're going to talk about what those various parties were interested in, what they were trying to accomplish, and the degree to which they got what they wanted out of this, because World War I and its aftermath definitely helps explain how modern Asia emerged and some of the trends that we're going to see here. So here's your takeaway, here's your objectives for our lesson today. Let's dive in and move forward. So the Japanese 100% got involved in World War I on the side of the Allies. They were part of the whole Anglo-Japanese Alliance thing, right? And so because of that, England was now at war with more than one country. And so the Japanese absolutely jumped in on the side of the British in order to help them out in this war. Here's your Anglo-Japanese Alliance. It's pretty straightforward. And so obviously demonstrates why Japan would be on the side of the Allies in World War I. Japan during this time had seen increasing militarism during the Taisho era. We talked previously about how the Taisho emperor really didn't exert much power and because of his physical and mental disabilities, and how the Japanese constitutional system meant that without an emperor to go between the military and civilian parts of the government, the Japanese military is going to mostly do what they were doing. And so they're going to build up their own independent power base and their ability to act independently. And this is going to be really problematic for the Japanese going forward. But for right now, the military is going to be looking to expand Japanese territory and expand the sort of stature of Japan in the world and all these sort of things. And so we're going to see the Japanese moving in and starting to take over more territories. They're going to specifically attack German colonies and try to take over German territories. And they're going to try to, again, sort of expand the extent that they can in Asia. You're going to see very little Japanese involvement in the European theater of the war. But as we talked about, Germany has colonies and spheres of influence in Asia, and the Japanese are going to try to take those to the extent possible. And so we see Germany's sphere of influence here, right along the sort of northern China Guangdong Peninsula. And so we're going to try to see the Japanese moving in there. As we hopefully remember, China has not been doing well. They lost the Boxer Rebellion or the Yehetian movement to the Eight Nations Alliance. Xi Ji has mostly stymied reform, and so the Qing dynasty is holding on barely as mostly a powerless puppet, with their territory being administered by either local power sources or foreigners. This eventually leads to the formal collapse of the Qing dynasty. At the Wuchang Uprising, imperial troops rise up and refuse to support the Qing dynasty anymore. The Qing dynasty raises a force to go put those troops down under Yuan Shikai here, but he is not going to follow through on that. And instead, what you see is independent armies growing up and basically declaring their independence from the Qing dynasty. And so we're going to see imperial authority begin to collapse. We're going to see an inability of the Qing dynasty to put down the Wuchang Uprising, leading to the Xinhai Revolution. This Xinhai Revolution is something that nationalists like Sun Yat-sen had been pushing for a significant amount of time. The Qing dynastic forces are now completely outmatched by the variety of different sort of local power sources. And so this is going to force the last emperor from power. The nationalists like Sun Yat-sen are going to come back in and try to remake China as a constitutional order. The hope being of these modernists that if they can break this dynastic system, they can finally modernize China, sweep away a lot of the old conservative elements that have prevented change, and really make China into a modern country, sort of the way that Japan was made into a modern country. And so they're going to try to kind of follow that model, set up constitutional government, and hopefully build a governing coalition in order to restore order and peace. This Republic of China, sort of founded by Sun Yat-sen, is going to try to unify all the various ethnic groups, the Manchurians, the Tibetans, and the Han Chinese, and all the various other groups in here, through these three principles: democracy, nationalism, and economic development. The revolutionaries under Sun Yat-sen understood that without appeasing the military, they basically had no ability to actually take control over China. There were powerful military leaders throughout all of the population centers of China, and without having a preponderance of military force, there's really no way that they're going to get these various regional Chinese leaders to support their centralized government. And so rather than Sun or one of the other sort of revolutionaries taking over, instead they're going to ask Yuan Shikai here to become the president of the Republic of China. He's going to be a provisional president, just a temporary guy in charge until they can hold national elections. So they're going to give all power to this former Qing dynasty military general, and he's going to rule until elections can be held and power can be transferred to a civilian government. If you're starting to see some potential problems with this or some potential hitches, you are not alone. And this is not going to go as well as the Chinese revolutionaries are going to want because, yeah. But they do get the abdication of the Qing dynasty. The dynastic system ends. Puyi, the final emperor, is going to be deposed, and he's going to go into exile in Japan. And he's going to re-enter our story again in some really sad ways a little bit later. But for now, we're switching to a republican form of government. The emperor is going to hand over power, giving up the mandate of heaven, and Yuan Shikai is going to be the organizer of this new provisional government. So good. The principles that Sun Yat-sen is going to lay out is this basic plan forward here with military rule. Then the Chinese are going to learn about democratic processes. And then finally, we're going to move into this constitutional stage like you have in Japan with elections, with a constitution, with all those sort of fun things. So first stage, destroying the Qing dynasty and putting in military rule, and then a transitional period, and then moving to democracy. No problems at all with this. Unfortunately, Yuan Shikai is not on board with this. There's a series of elections. Yuan Shikai is the leader of what's called the Beiyang Army or the Northern Army, and he is going to start limiting the power of constitutional governments and assassinating leaders who oppose him. So, for example, they're going to hold an election. Song Zhaoren is going to be one of the elected to be president, and then he's going to get gunned down on a train station as he's getting ready to go to Beijing. So Yuan Shikai is then like, well, the guy who was supposed to be president is dead. Guess it's time for me to keep being president going forward. The elections, this new government, this new coalition government known as the Guomindang, is going to be officially the government of China, but every time someone tries to step up to the top spot, they run into the wall of Yuan Shikai, who's going to act as a de facto military dictator until eventually he's going to declare himself emperor and try to seize control of all of China. So Yuan Shikai throws a wrench in the whole process, and the transition to civilian rule does not happen in China. China does get involved in World War I, though, under Yuan Shikai, in that they're also going to join the Allies. So both China and Japan are going to join the Allies. The Chinese are going to provide substantial support for the Allies, sending huge amounts of resources across to help out the British and the French. We're also going to see large numbers of Chinese workers heading to England and France to fill in factories and places like that. You're going to see a whole generation of young Chinese traveling to the West in order to learn from and observe the Westerners during World War I through what's called the Chinese Labor Corps. And many of these Chinese people are going to be killed in submarine attacks, giving their life for the cause. And so, although very few Chinese people actually fought on the front lines of World War I, the Chinese were intimately involved in the conflict and were a very important part of the Allied powers. The Japanese, on the other hand, are going to demand during World War I that China cede more control of China to them. They're going to issue what's called the 21 demands to China in the later phases of the war, hoping that now that European powers are distracted, the weakened Chinese government of Yuan Shikai is going to have no choice but to accede to these demands, which of course they don't. And so Yuan Shikai is going to sign on to the 21 demands and give, at least on paper, Japan significantly more control over China. You can see here some of these pieces here, and you can see how Japan is basically trying to make China a puppet state under Yuan Shikai. But then, before they can effectively do this, Yuan Shikai is going to die. And in his death, the centralized power of the centralized power of the Guomindang is going to totally collapse. China is going to fall into a period of chaos known as the warlord period, which we're going to have a lesson on later. And we're going to see centralized power go totally away, and various groups, including nationalists and communists, start to rise to power in an attempt to reunify China. So right now, we're not going to meet any of the warlords. We're not going to meet Mao Zedong or any of the Chinese nationalists yet. We're just going to leave it with the death of Yuan Shikai and the collapse of China into chaos and disorder. In India, Indians participated in the war also in relatively large numbers, more of them actually going to fight. There was a sense that amongst Indian nationalists that if the Indians showed their loyalty to the British Empire during World War I, that they would get greater rights in the aftermath of the war. And so we see Indians showing up and fighting in the trenches of World War I. But in the aftermath of the war, of course, they're going to demand additional rights. And the Ottoman Empire is going to jump in, but on the other side. The Ottoman Empire had, of course, been facing increasing encroachment from Russia, and so their natural ally here was the Central Powers. And so they're going to throw their weight into the war in 1915 on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, mostly to push back against encroachment from England and France, and to push back against specifically the Russians, who they were their traditional enemy. The group pushing for the Ottoman Empire to join the war were known as the Young Turks, and they're going to be some of the leaders. These modernizers are going to be some of the leaders of the new country of Turkey in the aftermath of the war, but of course, we're not quite there yet because first the Ottomans have to lose the war. But for now, look, the Ottomans are joining the Germans and the Austrians in this whole Central Powers thing. The Ottoman Empire is going to face exactly the same mobilization problems that Russia had. They're going to have limited railways, limited industrialization. They're going to struggle to get the materials, the weapons, the food, the uniforms, all these various things that you need. They're also going to struggle with disease. And so we're going to see the spreading of diseases, both typhus and this new form of flu that we're going to be talking about at the end, are going to spread across the Ottoman Empire, hampering their efforts. The Caucasus Campaign was an incredibly brutal assault by the Russians onto the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were pushed back by the Russians after this brutal fighting in the snow, and although weather conditions and wolves hampered the advance of both sides, the Ottoman Empire was forced to withdraw from parts of Armenia, which led to incredibly difficult conditions. Here's the fighting on the Caucasus front. Take a moment and pause and read. And in the aftermath of this, the Ottomans began forced relocations of various different ethnic groups, specifically the Armenians, who were seen as no longer loyal to the empire. During this forced location, many Armenians died, and even my use of the term genocide is going to be very controversial for the Turks. And so, in the end, you should read about the treatment of the Armenians and decide whether or not you think it's a genocide. So pause, read this, and go out and do your own reading about the treatment of the Armenians. And then I don't have to tell you whether or not it's a genocide, but somewhere in the area of 800,000 Armenians died as a course of this forced migration. The Ottoman Empire is going to launch an attack on Egypt to try to take the Suez Canal, and they're going to be fought back. They're going to be forced back by a combination of British and Egyptian forces. The British are then going to sponsor a revolt of the Arab peoples within the Ottoman Empire, famously dispatching T.E. Lawrence to help mobilize the various Arab peoples to push back against the Ottomans. This is going to lead to increased Arab nationalism and really this growth of British influence within the new countries of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, places like that. And so we're going to spend some more time talking about that. And of course, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement once we get there. And in the Gallipoli Campaign, the British are going to launch a spectacular attack on the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits in an attempt to get supplies to Russia, which had been cut off from the Ottoman control over this sort of connection between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In the end, it was a combination of British, French, and Australian and New Zealander forces. And the Gallipoli Campaign, much like all of the rest of the campaigns in World War I, is going to devolve into unpleasant trench warfare and substantial death. So take a moment, pause, read this, then we'll move on. This stalemate is going to cost substantial lives on both sides, and in the end, in Gallipoli, like most of these other fronts, there's almost no movement and a huge loss of life. So that's the effect of World War I on Asia. When we take a moment, we're going to pause here and leave you for today. And when we come back, we're going to look at the American entry into the war, and we're going to bring the war to a close and then start really talking about the aftermath and the effect of World War I. Thank you for listening.